He was certain he had no children, until two identical little girls looked up at him in a hotel lobby and everything he believed collapsed. Michael Harris had built his life on certainty. It was the quality that had carried him from a small rented office to the top floor of a glass tower downtown, where the city stretched beneath his windows like something already conquered. As a CEO and a millionaire, he trusted facts, contracts, numbers that could be verified and controlled. Feelings were useful only when they did not interfere with logic, and the past was something he preferred to keep neatly closed, filed away like an old report no longer relevant. He was certain of one thing above all else: he had no children. The thought never troubled him. It existed quietly, unquestioned, like a settled truth. His relationships had ended cleanly, without complications that followed him into the present. He had never received late-night calls, never been confronted with accusations or secrets, never had a reason to doubt the story he told himself. His life was full, busy, successful, and he believed that if something as significant as a child had existed, he would have known. 5 years earlier, when Sarah Blake walked out of his apartment for the last time, he had assumed it was simply the natural end of something that no longer fit. She had stood near the door, her brown hair pulled back loosely, her blue eyes tired in a way he chose not to notice. She spoke softly that evening, carefully, as if choosing words that would not provoke an argument. Michael, already distracted by emails and an upcoming trip, interpreted her calm as resignation. He told her he was leaving the country for work, that it was important, that it would open doors he had been knocking on for years. He spoke confidently, the way he always did when he believed ambition justified everything else. Sarah listened without interrupting, her hands folded in front of her, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she nodded once. "Do what you need to do," she said. Michael took that as understanding. He did not ask if she was all right. He did not ask if there was anything else she wanted to say. He kissed her on the cheek, promised they would talk soon, and left with the comfortable assumption that some things simply resolved themselves without effort. In the years that followed, his life accelerated. Success came quickly, then multiplied. He moved into hotels that felt more like temporary offices than places to rest, flew between cities without remembering the view from the plane, and surrounded himself with people who admired his discipline. When colleagues asked about his personal life, he answered vaguely, saying he had once been in love, but that chapter was over. Sometimes, late at night, when the city lights reflected faintly against the glass walls of his office, Sarah's name surfaced unexpectedly in his thoughts. He imagined her happy, settled, perhaps married to someone who stayed home more than he ever had. That image brought him a strange sense of relief. If she was happy, then nothing had been lost. If she was happy, then his choices had not hurt anyone in a way that mattered. He never questioned that belief. Michael did not know that certainty can be fragile when it is built on assumptions instead of truth. He did not know that an entire life could exist just beyond his awareness, growing quietly without him. And as he stood in the lobby of a luxury hotel years later, checking his phone and preparing for another predictable meeting, he had no idea that his most carefully held conviction was about to collapse with a single glance. Because until that moment, he truly believed that he had no children. And belief, he would soon learn, was not the same as reality. Sarah Blake discovered the truth on an ordinary morning that was supposed to be forgettable. The sky outside was overcast, the kind of gray that pressed low against the city, and she moved through her small apartment on autopilot, making coffee she barely drank and checking the time too often. The quiet felt heavier than usual, settling into her chest in a way she couldn't explain. When the realization finally surfaced, it came not as panic, but as a slow, unsettling certainty that refused to be ignored. She stared at the test in her hands longer than she should have, as if waiting for it to contradict itself. It didn't. The result stayed clear and undeniable, grounding her in a reality she had not prepared for. For a moment, she simply sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the next room, trying to understand how something so small could alter the entire direction of her life. Michael was the first person she thought of, and that thought brought a sharp ache with it. She imagined his reaction with painful clarity, the way his jaw would tighten as he processed the information, how quickly his mind would move to logistics and responsibility. She knew him well enough to understand that he would not walk away from something like this, but she also knew the cost. He would return not because he wanted to, but because he believed he had to. That idea frightened her more than being alone. Sarah picked up her phone, scrolled to his name, and let her thumb hover over the screen. She imagined the conversation, rehearsed it silently, then imagined the long silence that would follow. The weight of that silence felt unbearable. Slowly, she set the phone down without making the call, telling herself she just needed time to think, time to breathe, time to be sure. The confirmation at the doctor's office came a few days later, delivered with calm professionalism and a gentle smile. The room was bright and sterile, filled with quiet reassurance that did nothing to ease the tension in her chest. When the doctor adjusted the screen and pointed, explaining what she was seeing, Sarah's breath caught. "Twins," the doctor said, almost cheerfully. "Everything looks healthy." The word echoed in her mind long after the appointment ended. Twins. 2 lives. 2 futures now tied entirely to her decisions. She walked out of the clinic and sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Tears came then, sudden and overwhelming, not from fear alone, but from the realization that there was no version of this future that would be simple. That evening, she wrote Michael a message and deleted it. Then she wrote another. Each one felt wrong, either too emotional or too cold, too demanding or too distant. None of them captured the complexity of what she felt or the choice she was facing. She wanted him to know, but she didn't want to trap him. She wanted support, but not obligation. She wanted honesty, but not pity. Days turned into weeks, and her silence began to feel intentional rather than temporary. Sarah adjusted her life quietly, making changes she told herself were practical. She moved to a smaller place, closer to medical care, and began saving money with careful discipline. She told her closest friend the truth, accepting help only when it was offered without pressure or judgment. At night, when the world finally slowed, she lay awake with her hands resting on her stomach, feeling the subtle shifts and changes inside her. She spoke softly into the darkness, promising safety and love to 2 lives she had not yet met. Those moments filled her with a fierce determination that surprised her, a strength born not from confidence, but from necessity. She thought of Michael often, especially when fear crept in quietly. She wondered what kind of father he would have been, whether he would have smiled the same way when nervous, whether he would have softened in the presence of children. The thoughts hurt, but they also reinforced her decision. She could not build a future for her children on uncertainty, on a choice made out of duty rather than desire. So she remained silent. Sarah convinced herself she was doing the right thing, that protecting her children meant protecting them from a life defined by compromise. She believed that if Michael never knew, he could continue building the life he wanted, and she could build one of her own without resentment. What she did not yet understand was that silence, once chosen, does not fade with time. It grows, shaping years, shaping lives, and waiting patiently for the moment when it finally demands to be heard. The pregnancy reshaped Sarah's life with a quiet insistence that left no room for denial. Her body changed faster than she expected, as if the twins were determined to make their presence known early and often. Fatigue settled into her bones, not the kind that sleep could cure, but a constant heaviness that followed her through each day. Still, she forced herself into routine, believing structure was the only way to keep fear from taking control. Doctor visits became frequent and strangely intimate. She learned the sound of 2 heartbeats, slightly out of sync, steady and persistent, filling the room with a rhythm that grounded her even when anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. The doctor spoke carefully, explaining risks and precautions, reminding her that carrying twins required attention and restraint. Sarah listened closely, asked questions, and followed instructions with disciplined focus, determined not to leave anything to chance. There were nights when the silence of her apartment felt unbearable. She would sit on the couch, one hand resting on her stomach, the other wrapped tightly around a mug of tea gone cold, and let the weight of everything press in. In those moments, Michael's face appeared in her thoughts uninvited. She wondered where he was, whether he still worked late into the night, whether he ever paused long enough to miss her. The questions came with no answers, only a dull ache she learned to live with. As the months passed, financial reality grew more urgent. Sarah took on additional freelance work, often staying up late to meet deadlines, her eyes burning from exhaustion as she stared at her screen. She cut expenses without hesitation, sold things she once loved, and accepted help only when it was offered gently and without expectation. Pride had no place here. Survival demanded practicality. The physical strain intensified in ways she hadn't anticipated. Simple movements left her breathless. Swelling became constant, and there were days when standing too long made her dizzy. More than once, she ended up in the emergency room late at night, the bright lights and hurried voices heightening her fear as she waited to hear whether everything was still all right. Each time, she was reassured, but the message was always the same. She had to be careful. She had to slow down. Slowing down forced her to think. Sarah began writing in a notebook she kept hidden in a drawer, filling page after page with thoughts she never planned to share. She wrote letters to her unborn daughters, describing the world she hoped to give them, the values she wanted them to grow up with, the strength she was learning to find within herself. Sometimes she wrote to Michael too, not accusations or pleas, but quiet explanations of choices he would never know she made. Writing became a way to breathe, a place where fear and love could exist side by side without judgment. When her water broke earlier than expected, panic surged through her with startling clarity. The hospital ride felt unreal, the city lights blurring past as contractions came faster and harder. She focused on breathing, on staying present, on trusting her body and the people around her. Fear tried to take hold, whispering doubts about doing this alone, about the risks she could not fully control. The delivery was long and exhausting, pushing her past every limit she thought she had. Pain came in waves that left her shaking, but she refused to let go, clinging to the sound of her own breathing and the steady reassurance of the medical staff. When the first cry filled the room, sharp and insistent, tears streamed down her face without warning. The second followed moments later, just as strong, just as alive. 2 girls. Emma and Claire. They were placed against her chest one after the other, small and warm and impossibly real. Their blonde hair was damp, their blue eyes barely open, their tiny hands curling instinctively as if searching for something to hold on to. In that moment, exhaustion melted into something fierce and undeniable. Love, raw and overwhelming, settled deep into her chest, anchoring her completely. Later, alone in the quiet of the recovery room, Sarah watched her daughters sleep in their bassinets, side by side, their breathing soft and even. She felt the familiar ache of Michael's absence then, sharper now that she understood fully what he had missed. For a brief moment, she reached for her phone, imagining his reaction if she told him everything now. She stopped herself. Instead, she looked back at Emma and Claire and made a silent promise. She would protect them, even if it meant carrying the weight of this choice alone. She would give them a life built on honesty, stability, and love, not on uncertainty or obligation. That night, as the hospital grew quiet around her, Sarah understood something with absolute clarity. Whatever lay ahead would be difficult. There would be moments of doubt, fear, and exhaustion she could not yet imagine. But she was no longer alone. And she would never allow herself to forget that. The years that followed blurred together in a way Sarah never could have imagined before motherhood. Time no longer moved in clean segments marked by milestones she could anticipate. Instead, it flowed unevenly, shaped by growth spurts, illnesses, small victories, and moments of exhaustion that seemed endless at the time but later felt impossibly brief. Emma and Claire grew quickly, as twins often do, pushing Sarah to adapt constantly, to learn faster than she ever thought possible. The first year was survival more than anything else. Nights dissolved into mornings without clear boundaries, and Sarah learned to function on instinct rather than rest. The girls had different temperaments from the beginning. Emma was quieter, observant even as a baby, studying faces with a seriousness that felt almost unsettling at times. Claire was expressive and loud, quick to cry and just as quick to laugh, demanding attention with unapologetic determination. Sarah learned to tell their cries apart, to sense what each needed before the sound fully formed. Money was always a concern. Sarah worked whenever she could, taking remote contracts during naps, answering emails with one hand while holding a bottle with the other. She measured expenses carefully, choosing necessities over comfort, and learned how little she actually needed for herself. Everything revolved around the girls. Their safety. Their health. Their future. That focus gave her strength on days when exhaustion threatened to swallow her whole. As Emma and Claire grew into toddlers, the apartment filled with movement and noise. Toys scattered across the floor, tiny shoes appeared in unexpected places, and laughter replaced the constant crying of infancy. Sarah watched them interact with quiet amazement, fascinated by the bond they shared. They fought, made up, protected each other, and communicated in ways that often excluded the rest of the world. It was beautiful and intimidating all at once. There were moments when Sarah allowed herself to imagine Michael in their lives. She wondered how he would react to their questions, how he would respond to Emma's thoughtful silences or Claire's endless energy. Sometimes she caught herself smiling at those imagined scenes, only to feel the familiar guilt settle in afterward. She reminded herself of the reasons she had stayed silent, repeating them like a mantra when doubt crept in late at night. By the time the girls turned 4, life had found a fragile rhythm. Sarah had moved again, this time to a place that felt less temporary, closer to schools and parks, closer to something resembling stability. Emma and Claire started preschool, clinging to Sarah's legs on the first day before running off hand in hand without looking back. Sarah stood there long after they disappeared inside, her chest tight with pride and a sharp sense of loss she hadn't anticipated. It was during these years that Sarah began to notice how often strangers commented on the girls' appearance. Their blonde hair, their bright blue eyes, the way they looked so alike yet carried themselves so differently. People smiled, asked questions, joked about future heartbreakers. Sarah smiled back, answered politely, and deflected anything that felt too personal. She had grown used to guarding her story carefully, sharing only what felt safe. The hotel became part of her life almost by accident. What began as temporary work turned into a steady position, one that offered flexibility and just enough income to ease the constant financial pressure. It wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable. Sarah appreciated the structure, the quiet professionalism, the way she could focus on tasks without emotional complication. The hotel was a place where she was simply competent and efficient, not defined by her past or her fears. Emma and Claire loved visiting her there on quiet afternoons, marveling at the polished floors and tall windows. They treated it like a small adventure, holding Sarah's hands tightly as they walked through the lobby, their reflection stretching across the marble beneath their feet. Sarah watched them closely in those moments, unaware that the setting she considered neutral would one day become the place where everything she believed about the past would collide with the present. For now, life felt manageable. Not easy, but honest. Sarah had built something real with her daughters, something rooted in consistency and love rather than regret. She told herself that knowing the truth someday would be enough for the girls, that they didn't need more than what she could give them. She believed that the past had settled quietly behind her. She did not yet understand that some truths wait patiently, allowing years to pass, until the moment they are ready to be seen. The day everything changed began like any other, wrapped in routine and small, manageable expectations. Sarah woke early, helping Emma and Claire into matching dresses they had chosen themselves, both insisting on the same color but for entirely different reasons. Emma liked the softness of the fabric, while Claire liked the way it twirled when she spun in circles across the bedroom. Sarah watched them with a tired smile, unaware that this ordinary morning would divide her life into before and after. The hotel was busy that afternoon, filled with the quiet tension that always accompanied high-profile guests. Sarah moved through the lobby with practiced ease, greeting colleagues, answering questions, and keeping a watchful eye on the girls, who sat nearby drawing at a small table she had set up for them. They were used to waiting, used to staying close, and they behaved with the quiet confidence of children who felt safe. Emma was the first to notice him. She stopped coloring mid-stroke, her gaze lifting toward the entrance. Claire followed her attention seconds later, curiosity pulling her to her feet. Sarah was turned away, focused on a tablet in her hands, until she felt the shift in the air, the kind of instinctive awareness that made her look up without knowing why. Michael stood near the reception desk. Time seemed to slow, stretching each second painfully thin. He looked older, more composed, dressed in a tailored suit that fit him perfectly, his blonde hair neatly styled, his blue eyes scanning the lobby with distracted focus. For a brief, disorienting moment, Sarah wondered if exhaustion had finally caught up with her, if her mind had reached for an old memory and dressed it up as reality. Then he turned. Their eyes met across the lobby, and recognition struck instantly, sharp and undeniable. Michael froze, his expression shifting from polite indifference to stunned disbelief. Sarah felt her chest tighten as years of silence, fear, and unresolved emotion crashed into her all at once. She should have looked away. Instead, she stood still. Michael took a step forward without realizing he was moving. His gaze dropped, drawn inexplicably to the two little girls now standing beside Sarah. Emma held Claire's hand tightly, both of them watching him with open curiosity. The resemblance hit him like a physical blow. The blonde hair, the unmistakable blue eyes, the familiar shape of their faces that mirrored his own in a way no coincidence could explain. His breath caught. For a moment, the lobby faded into background noise. Conversations blurred, footsteps echoed distantly, and all Michael could see were the children standing in front of the woman he once loved. His mind raced, rejecting the possibility even as his instincts screamed the truth. Sarah felt exposed in a way she never had before. Every reason she had clung to over the years suddenly felt fragile under the weight of reality. She straightened instinctively, positioning herself slightly in front of the girls, not to hide them, but to anchor herself. "Sarah?" Michael said finally, his voice unsteady. "Yes," she replied quietly. Silence stretched between them, thick with everything that had been left unsaid. Michael's gaze flicked back to the girls, his jaw tightening as understanding slowly, painfully took shape. "How old are they?" he asked, already knowing the answer. 5, Sarah said. The number landed heavily. 5 years. 5 years of birthdays, first words, scraped knees, bedtime stories. 5 years he had never known existed. "They're yours," she said before he could ask. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a confession. It was simply the truth. Michael felt the floor shift beneath him. He swallowed hard, fighting to maintain control as emotion threatened to break through his carefully constructed composure. He had built his life on certainty, and now it was unraveling in front of him, thread by thread. Emma tilted her head slightly, studying his face with quiet intensity. "Mom," she whispered, "why does he look like us?" Sarah closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "Because," she said softly, "he's your father." Michael's eyes filled despite his efforts to remain composed. He dropped to one knee instinctively, bringing himself to their level, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Hi," he managed. "I'm Michael." Claire smiled, immediate and fearless. "I'm Claire," she said brightly, pointing to her sister. "And she's Emma." Something inside Michael shattered completely. In that moment, surrounded by the polished elegance of the hotel lobby, he understood with devastating clarity what he had lost. The life he had assumed moved on without him had been living quietly, growing, waiting in a place he never thought to look. And for the first time in years, certainty abandoned him entirely, leaving behind only one undeniable truth. He was a father. And he was 5 years too late. Michael did not remember how he left the lobby or how he ended up sitting in a quiet corner of the hotel cafe with Sarah across from him and the girls between them. Everything after that first shock felt unreal, as if his body was moving on instinct while his mind struggled to catch up. Emma sat very straight, her small hands folded in her lap, watching him with intense focus. Claire swung her legs under the chair, humming softly, already less tense, as if she had decided he was not a threat. Sarah was the calmest person in the room, and that frightened Michael more than anger would have. Her composure was not cold, but practiced, the kind that came from years of handling everything alone. He realized then that this was not a moment she had imagined or prepared for. It was simply something she had always known would happen eventually. "You were sure I was happy with someone else," she said quietly, not accusing, not defensive, just stating a fact. Michael nodded slowly. "I told myself that for years. It made it easier to live with everything." "With leaving," Sarah replied gently. "Yes," he admitted. "With leaving." He looked at the girls again, searching their faces for himself and finding far more than he expected. The way Emma frowned slightly when she concentrated, the way Claire smiled without hesitation, trusting the world to meet her halfway. These were not abstract ideas or missed possibilities. They were real children with personalities, habits, and a life he had never touched. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice low but steady, though it took effort to keep it that way. Sarah inhaled slowly before answering. "Because I knew you would come back out of responsibility, not choice. And I couldn't build their lives on that." The truth of it cut deeply, precisely because he knew she was right. He had always done what was expected of him, what was logical, what maintained control. Love, when it complicated things, had been postponed. He stared down at his hands, noticing for the first time that they were shaking. "I would have stayed," he said quietly. "You didn't stay when there was nothing holding you," she replied. "I couldn't risk you leaving again when there was." Silence followed, heavy but not hostile. The girls sensed it too. Emma leaned closer to Sarah, while Claire reached out and touched Michael's sleeve with open curiosity. "Are you sad?" Claire asked him simply. Michael swallowed. "A little," he said honestly. She nodded, satisfied with the answer, and went back to swinging her legs. That small exchange broke something open in him. He realized that whatever anger or confusion he felt mattered less than what stood in front of him now. Two little girls who did not know his mistakes, only his presence in this moment. "I don't want to disappear," he said, looking at Sarah again. "I don't want to be someone they meet once and then never see again." Sarah studied him closely, weighing his words not against his emotions, but against his history. "Then don't make promises," she said. "Just show up. Again and again. That's the only thing that matters." "I can do that," Michael replied immediately, then stopped himself. "No. I will do that." The rest of the afternoon passed slowly and awkwardly. Michael walked with them through the hotel garden, keeping his distance but staying close enough that the girls could see him whenever they turned around. Emma asked careful questions about where he lived and what he did, while Claire asked if he liked ice cream and whether he could run fast. He answered everything, even when he didn't know how to explain his world to children who had never needed it. When it was time for Sarah to leave, Michael felt a sharp panic rise in his chest. He was not ready for the moment to end, not ready to return to a life that now felt incomplete. "I'll call," he said quickly, then paused, unsure if that was too much. Sarah nodded once. "You can." As they walked away, Claire turned back and waved enthusiastically. Emma hesitated, then gave him a small, serious nod. Michael stood there long after they were gone, the hotel suddenly too quiet, too empty. He understood now that certainty had been an illusion, and that the most important part of his life had existed without him, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. For the first time in years, he did not know exactly what the future looked like. But for the first time, he knew where he needed to be. The weeks that followed tested everyone in ways none of them could have fully anticipated. Michael did not attempt to force himself into a role he had not earned, and Sarah noticed that restraint immediately. He called when he said he would, arrived when he promised, and left when it was time without lingering or trying to negotiate more than she was ready to give. There were no dramatic speeches, no attempts to rewrite the past with apologies that sounded rehearsed. Instead, there was consistency, quiet and deliberate. At first, their meetings took place in neutral spaces. Parks, cafes with children's corners, open areas where Emma and Claire felt comfortable and free. Michael learned to sit on the ground without caring who saw him, learned to push swings, learned the precise way Claire liked her hair tied and how Emma needed time before answering questions. He observed more than he spoke, absorbing details as if they were instructions he could not afford to forget. Sarah watched closely, never relaxing completely. She noticed how Michael always looked to her before making decisions, how he asked permission instead of assuming it. When the girls grew tired or overstimulated, he didn't protest when Sarah said it was time to go. That mattered more than she wanted to admit. Trust, she reminded herself, was not built through emotion, but through repeated respect. There were moments of tension too. One afternoon, Michael brought small gifts without warning, and Sarah's expression hardened instantly. He caught it immediately and apologized, explaining he hadn't thought it through. He didn't argue when she told him it was too soon. He took the gifts back to his car and never mentioned them again. That silence, that acceptance, spoke louder than defense ever could. Emma remained cautious. She asked thoughtful questions that revealed how much she understood without fully comprehending. "Are you going to leave like other people do?" she asked one day, her voice quiet but direct. Michael knelt in front of her, careful not to make promises he couldn't guarantee. "I'm here right now," he said. "And I plan to keep coming back." Emma considered that carefully, then nodded. It was not forgiveness, but it was something close to allowance. Claire, on the other hand, accepted him with effortless warmth. She climbed onto his lap without asking, told him long, rambling stories that made little sense, and laughed freely when he joined her games without hesitation. Michael cherished those moments, even as he understood that trust came differently for each child. At night, when the girls were asleep, Sarah found herself thinking about Michael more than she wanted to. She replayed his actions, not his words, comparing them to the man she had once known. He seemed quieter now, less certain, shaped by something that looked like humility. That scared her. Change could be temporary. Effort could fade. Still, cracks appeared in the walls she had built so carefully. One evening, after a long day, she invited Michael inside for the first time since the hotel. The apartment was modest, filled with toys, drawings taped to the walls, and the unmistakable signs of a life built around children. Michael stepped in slowly, visibly aware that he was entering a space he had not helped create. "This is our home," Sarah said, not defensively, but firmly. "It's beautiful," he replied, and meant it. The girls showed him their room with pride, pointing out favorite toys and arguing over which bed was whose, even though they were identical. Michael listened, smiled, asked questions, and followed their lead. When it was time for him to leave, he didn't linger, didn't try to extend the evening. He hugged the girls gently and thanked Sarah for trusting him enough to let him in. After the door closed behind him, Sarah leaned against it and closed her eyes. Her heart felt heavy, but not with fear alone. There was something else there now, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. Hope. She hated how easily it slipped in, uninvited and persistent. She hated that a part of her wanted to believe that this time might be different. More than anything, she hated how much that hope made her vulnerable. Because if Michael failed them now, the damage would not be hers alone. And yet, as the days continued and he kept showing up, Sarah began to understand that the hardest risk she had ever taken was not raising her daughters alone. It was deciding whether to let someone else stand beside her. The moment Sarah realized things had truly changed did not come with a confession or a dramatic promise. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first, woven into the rhythm of ordinary life that had slowly reshaped itself around Michael's presence. He was no longer a visitor whose arrival disrupted the day. He had become part of it, someone whose absence was now felt when he wasn't there. Months passed, steady and uneventful in the best possible way. Michael adjusted his schedule without announcing it, declining trips that would take him away for too long, rearranging meetings so he could be present for school pickups and small moments that once would have seemed insignificant to him. He learned the names of Emma and Claire's teachers, attended school events without drawing attention to himself, and sat through performances where the girls waved at him from the stage, their faces lighting up when they found him in the crowd. Sarah watched all of it with cautious disbelief. She noticed how Michael never complained about the chaos, how he listened when she spoke, really listened, even when the conversation was about something as simple as a bad day or a broken toy. He didn't try to fix everything. Sometimes he just stayed quiet, offering presence instead of solutions, and that mattered more than he understood. There were difficult conversations too. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Sarah finally voiced the fear she had carried for years. She spoke about the nights she had cried alone, about the exhaustion that had nearly broken her, about the resentment she was afraid to feel now that he was here. Michael didn't interrupt. He didn't defend himself. When she finished, he admitted that hearing it hurt, but that it should hurt, because it was the truth. "I can't undo what I missed," he said. "But I can take responsibility for what comes next." For the first time, Sarah believed him. The girl sensed the shift before either adult named it. Emma began to relax around him, no longer watching his movements with quiet suspicion. She started sharing her thoughts freely, asking him for help with homework, sitting close to him on the couch while reading. Claire had long since claimed him as hers, announcing proudly to strangers that he was their dad, daring the world to challenge it. The day Emma introduced Michael as her father at school without hesitation, Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her heart pounding. She looked at him, ready to see panic or uncertainty, but instead she saw something steady and certain in his expression. He accepted the word not as a title he demanded, but as a responsibility he carried carefully. Life did not suddenly become perfect. There were disagreements, misunderstandings, moments when old wounds resurfaced unexpectedly. Sarah still struggled with control, with the instinct to handle everything herself. Michael still fought the urge to overcompensate, to fix what could only be healed by time. But they faced those moments together, openly, without retreat. One evening, as they sat outside watching Emma and Claire chase fireflies in the fading light, Michael reached for Sarah's hand without looking at her. She didn't pull away. The simple contact felt more meaningful than any grand declaration ever could. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "About you. About everything." Sarah squeezed his hand once. "I know." Years earlier, Michael had been certain he had no children. That certainty had shaped his life, justified his choices, and shielded him from truths he wasn't ready to face. Now, certainty looked different. It wasn't about control or predictability. It was about presence, commitment, and showing up even when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. He watched his daughters laugh, their blonde hair glowing in the soft light, their blue eyes full of trust, and felt a quiet peace settle over him. Not relief, not triumph, but acceptance. He had missed the beginning. But he had not missed the chance to stay. And for the first time, that was enough.